Welcome. We are visiting today with Dr. Craig R. Smith, Professor of Communications and Director of the Center for First Amendment Studies here at Cal State University, Long Beach. Craig, it is such a joy to see and have the opportunity to speak with you today.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here.
You are coming out now with your 16th book.
Yeah, that's right.
This one's a little bit different than most of your academically oriented books, called Confessions of a Presidential Speechwriter. Now, when I first heard the title, I must say, and I saw Confessions, my mind immediately went to St. Augustine's Confessions. Yes. So my question to you is, will you be repenting, recanting, and regaling in this book?
Well, I'm going to tell some tales that haven't been told before, behind the scenes, not only in the president's, in the White House and at the National Republican Senatorial Committee, but at CBS, where I worked. Started there as a graduate intern and then was a consultant for conventions and election nights, and there's a lot of fun stuff to talk about regarding Walter Cronkite and Diane Sawyer and Dan Rather, so that's all going to be in there.
Will there be secrets that we've never heard?
Yes, there are.
Would you like to just share maybe one?
Well, I think there was a moment when I got into a little argument with one of the anchor people at CBS, and he kind of yelled, "I don't trust you because you're a right-wing nut." And I responded, "I'm not a right-wing nut, I'm an independent conservative, and furthermore, I'm right." And he said, "I think you're wrong." And so the research unit then did the research on the question, and the question was about when Ronald Reagan had first used a certain phrase, and it turned out I was right and that anchor person was wrong, and that was the fun we had.
So there will be definitely stories we have not heard before.
Yes, yes.
Who is this book aimed towards?
The book is aimed at kind of anyone who's interested in presidential rhetoric, presidential speech making, how to become a speechwriter, how to become a consultant to a national news organization. Any of those things, I think, would be interesting. I think political scientists would be interested in it to see how commercials are made, how opposition research is done. We did a lot of that at the National Republican Senatorial Committee on our opponents, and how we put that information together and used it effectively in campaigns.
Speaking of commercials in campaigns, what did you think of the commercials in this recent campaign, presidential campaign?
I thought they were appalling, quite frankly. When I was at the Senatorial Committee, one of the things we wanted to make sure that did not happen was that somebody could say about our ad it was false. We were the fact checkers. And at that time, you're probably too young to remember, but there was the National Conservative Political Action Committee that was operating in the like 1980, and they would distort people's records.
I'm not too young.
They would distort people's records, and then they lost their credibility. And so my boss at the Senatorial Committee said, "That's not going to happen. If you say that this person voted for something, I want to make sure they voted for that thing and not for an appropriations bill that it was attached to. And I want to make sure that they voted for it not once, but twice or 3 times." So we got very credible with the advertising that we inspired in campaigns. And it's really disappointing to see on both sides in this last election the number of inaccuracies, because that just ruins your credibility once that's out. Then, and I think today the public just says, "I don't listen to the advertising. I'm going to watch the debates and see what that guy's like in a debate, but I'm not watching I'm not listening to the advertising."
I hope you're right that they weren't listening. I wonder if the internet has contributed to that, because so much floats around the internet that is purported to be true, and there's no attribution to any of it. And you know, so-and-so said this, and well, I don't know that they said that. Yep. If you didn't have Snopes.com, you wouldn't know what was true and what wasn't. Well, you did not begin as a speechwriter. That was not your goal, correct?
No, when I was in college, I wanted to be a high school history teacher. And then some professors said, "You know, you could become a college professor." And they encouraged me and inspired me and mentored me, and I eventually became a college professor, and I was enjoying it. I had been a college professor for 7 years when the opportunity to go to the White House came along, and that was just something I couldn't pass up. That was such a leap up from where I had been, and such a piece of good fortune that I couldn't turn it down.
Well, going from academia to politics, and politics at their highest level, how did that change your life?
There's more politics in education than there is education in politics, so the transition was easier than you think.
That's pretty funny.
In politics, people know what it's about. It's about power. Some people use their power to do good. Some people use their power just to get famous, but it's about power and nobody hides that. In the academic community, it's unfashionable to admit that you want power. And so there's all this kind of backroom hypocrisy that goes on in the academic community that doesn't go on in the political world. And so the transition was kind of refreshing for me to kind of get away from the academic hypocrisy and to get into the fresh light of politics.
But politics is so brutal.
It can be, but I was always lucky. I worked for very honest people like Gerald Ford and George Bush Sr. I worked in campaigns that were all above board. If I ever found anything that was untoward, I got away from it. I remember there was a man running for governor of Alabama when I was working down there, and I had written a speech for him, and in the question and answer period after the speech, he made a racist remark. And I immediately went up to him and said, I'm never writing a speech for you again. I don't want the money for this one, and I don't want to be around you. And I'll tell you, you better clean up your act. You're never going to be elected to anything.
So there are still a few good men and women out there?
There are. There's lots of them. We hear about the bad people and we hear about sensational things that go on. But they're really rare when you look at you have 435 people in the House of Representatives and you hear about 2 or 3 bad eggs every once in a while.
Who do you particularly admire right now in Congress?
I think that I've always admired Paul Ryan. I think you know exactly where he's coming from. I think in this campaign he presented an alternative that was clear for the American people to see. He's articulate and bright. He's one of the people that I admire very much. The governor of Ohio, John Kasich, is an articulate man who was on the Budget Committee in the House of Representatives. I think he would make a fine national leader.
As a speechwriter, one of the things I find the most intriguing is that you have to write not as you would speak, not as Craig Smith, Dr. Craig Smith, but as the person speaks. You have to hear their voice and capture their voice on paper. How do you do that?
I think the biggest mistake speechwriters make, and why they don't last in the job very often, is because they try to put words in someone's mouth that's unnatural for them. What you have to do is study that person thoroughly. When I went to work at the White House, I read all the testimony that Gerald Ford had given when he became Vice President of the United States. I read every speech he'd given as Vice President. I interviewed him and talked to him about the words he liked and the words he didn't like. He was raised in Central Michigan, but certain words are pronounced differently in Central Michigan than they are in the rest of the country. They say judgment instead of judgment, and the press makes fun of you when you mispronounce something. Mm-hmm. So that word was out of any of his speeches. He wanted to talk the language of the common man. Now, in my opinion, Franklin Roosevelt spoke the language of the common man. You don't have to use big words to be eloquent. I mean, think about Franklin Roosevelt. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. One syllable all the way through, and everybody remembers that line because of the repetition in it. So there are things you can do with simple words that will make someone eloquent without making them sound like they're talking above their level.
Well, now you're getting into the area of rhetoric.
Yeah.
And the devices of rhetoric. As a speechwriter, are you conscious, and what kinds of devices do you most like to use? Oh,
there's a whole catalog of devices. First of all, let's define rhetoric properly, because people misuse it. They say that's mere rhetoric, or that's not the truth, it's rhetoric. Rhetoric for the ancients, for the Greeks and the Romans, meant the art of finding in any given situation the available means of persuasion. So that's an art form. What are the available means of persuasion? If I'm speaking and there's an American flag on the wall, I can refer to that American flag, or this one, and that's an available means of persuasion. So your catalog includes a lot of things. I mean, you want to enhance the speaker's credibility, which means playing to his prior reputation, showing that he or she has goodwill, showing that they have character, that they've made decisions of leadership, that they know what they're talking about. Now, that's just one category. Then we have appeals to emotion, which emotions you're going to appeal to, how do you move an audience from one state of mind to another, and then direct it toward your goal. You have logic, Do you use inductive arguments, and do you have the evidence for those? Do you use deductive arguments, and do you have the premises for those? Style in language, delivery, organization of the speech. All of those go into the speech writing operation. So it's very complicated.
Would you call that sort of a noble manipulation?
Well, yeah. We use rhetoric all the time. If there's smoke in a theater, you're going to yell fire. You're not going to say, let me think about this, let me present two sides of the question to you. No, you got to do what the situation demands, and the available means of persuasion there is to yell for fire and get people out of the theater. So rhetoric can also be quite noble. When you're speaking to a hostile or an independent audience, to keep your credibility, you have to present both sides of the question. Then you draw your conclusion out, and you look reasonable when you do that.
You spoke about pronunciation of words, and I think about the little things that can just torpedo a speaker.
Yeah.
Rick Perry in the
Yeah.
presidential debates, not being able to remember that third department,
yeah.
yes. George W. Bush, for 8 years, pronouncing nuclear.
Right.
Had he pronounced that word correctly, would he have been perceived as smarter?
Yes, there is a whole connection between pronunciation and credibility, and and also being able to spell. The very unfair story about Dan Quayle and the potato was that it was on the teacher's card spelled wrong. The teacher had spelled it wrong, and Quayle was, not going to second guess the teacher, and everybody blamed him. Which was unfortunate, and then one error compounded to another error, and before long, poor Quayle had lost a lot of his credibility. That's why you rehearse a speech. Let's make sure that every word in here is pronounceable by the client, and that they can get through the speech and they know what they're talking about.
At what point in American history did we start using speechwriters? Lincoln didn't use a speechwriter, did he?
Well, Lincoln relied a little bit on Seward now and then, but
really?
Lincoln said that he learned how to write a good speech by reading Shakespeare in the King James Version of the Bible. But the first president, George Washington, had the first speechwriter.
No.
And it was Alexander Hamilton. He wrote a great many of George Washington's speeches. Now, Washington often overruled him as Reagan overruled his speechwriters. They wanted to take down. With Reagan, they wanted to tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev, out of the speech. They thought it was too violent. And he said, no, you're keeping that in. So you get overruled once in a while. I mean, a good client will overrule you and reassert. But yeah, the first president was the first one to have a speechwriter.
I wouldn't have guessed that. I was going to guess it was somewhere in the last 40 years.
The first official speechwriter was Judson Wooliver in the Coolidge administration. The first one to be called a speechwriter, but he wasn't allowed to put a sign on the door that said speechwriter. You know which president allowed them to put a sign on the door that said speechwriter? No. Richard Nixon. Mr. Secretive was the least secretive about his speechwriting operation, and he had one of the best speechwriting staffs in history. Look at those people went on and became very famous. William Safire at the New York Times, Pat Buchanan, Lee Hebner became the editor of the Herald Tribune in Europe. It was quite a group.
Can you select the best speechwriter that has been
other than me?
Sorry. Aside from you.
I think Ray Price, who worked for Nixon, was awfully good. He had a way of taking a complex lawyerly argument and stylizing it so that it was attractive. And I always admired Ray Price's work, particularly Nixon's acceptance speech in 1968. I think that's one of the best acceptance speeches ever written.
Really? Let's talk about another famous speech, and that would be John F. Kennedy's 1961 inaugural address, where the famous line, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Again, that's a rhetorical way of stating it. We don't know whether Kennedy wrote that. Certainly, I'm sure he was capable of writing. He was a very bright man. Maybe Theodore Sorensen wrote that. You think it was Theodore Sorensen? Today, that particular phrase, in this society that has become so entitlement focused, could you even use that phrase? Would you even hand that to a president to say today?
It would be very difficult. It would be very difficult. The inaugural address by Kennedy was written by several people, including Arthur Schlesinger. And there's a line in there about being careful when you ride on the back of a tiger because the tiger could eat you. And it's incongruous with the rest of the speech. And Schlesinger said it was always, he felt, of all the things he did in the Kennedy administration, putting that line in that speech he thought was the worst thing that he had done. But the main architect of that speech was Sorensen. And it's interesting because Kennedy was looking for a speechwriter back in the 50s when he was in the Senate, and nobody worked out. And here he had this staff aide from Nebraska named Ted Sorensen. And Sorensen said, let me try. And they immediately clicked. He wrote at Kennedy's level and it worked. Sometimes the speechwriter kind of moves with the client to hit a point where they're together. If you look at George W. Bush, for example, his inaugural didn't work all that well. It sounded like it was written for somebody way over his head. And so they brought him down and he came up. And where they met was when he gave the speech to a joint session of Congress after 2011, the attack. September 20th, 2001 was a brilliant speech by George W. Bush, and it made him President of the United States for real and for the first time. And that was important given how controversial it was how he got elected.
Who did you feel most simpatico with that you wrote for?
George Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush. He was a wonderful man. He was witty. He was bright. We became good friends.
I hear he's a nice man.
Nicest guy in the world. He would mark up the speeches. He would add things to them. He always had me leave the first page blank so he could write humor. Because he believed, like me, that humor had to be on the spot and instantaneous and not contrived. And so I never wrote anything for him at the beginning of a speech because he was so witty and could adapt to the local audience. And he became a friend, and that was great. It was an honor that he would accept me into his life and as a friend.
Do you stay in touch?
We have over the years, and I knew Jeb. I didn't know George W., but I did know Jeb, and Marvin, one of his other sons, was a student at the University of Virginia when I was there, and I knew Marvin.
Okay. Sort of an esoteric question for you. The French composer Claude Debussy wrote that music is the silence between the notes. Can that be applied to speech writing?
There are places where the silence is important. And I think what Debussy is getting at least what I would get at as a speechwriter, is what I call the enthymematic process, which is a big word for saying the audience needs to fill certain things in. That's how you involve them. You don't tell them everything, or you will bore them to death. So you leave certain obvious premises out that the audience fills in. Or you ask a rhetorical question and you pause and let the question sink in so that they can answer it in their head, and then you can move on. You can also pause to convey the fact that you're reflecting on something and thinking about it, and the audience then knows you're serious. So there are certain ways in which silence is conveying a message that's as important as the speech itself.
What's the best speech you've ever written?
Oh, that's a tough question. I think probably my favorite would be the speech during the bicentennial in 1976 when Gerald Ford went to Valley Forge. And I had the honor of being the chief writer of that speech. And to talk about the Battle of Valley Forge and our soldiers in their rag-bound feet, freezing that winter around the campfires, I was most proud of that work.
You really love this country, don't you?
Yes, yes. It's been very good to me. I've lived the American dream. I've gone from being a poor kid raised in a little city south of San Diego to working in the White House. I mean, I know it can happen here, and so I believe in it, and I hope we retain it, so that the kids that are are young and in high school now can dream about not only becoming a presidential speechwriter, but becoming President of the United States.
What is your best advice to someone who aspires to be a speechwriter?
First of all, learn to write, and you learn to write by reading good stuff. Read Hemingway, read Faulkner, read the great authors, read Shakespeare, read the King James Version of the Bible. I'm a Catholic, but reading the King James Version of the Bible because it is one of the most beautifully written documents in the history of the world. see how the words go together. And don't read for speed, read for content. Then write and rewrite and rewrite. The art of writing is rewriting. All the writing I do is draft after draft after draft. Roosevelt's speeches, Franklin Roosevelt's speeches were 10, 12 drafts before they were finalized. We were lucky to have time in the modern age in the Ford administration for 6 drafts, but we usually did get 5 or 6 drafts of a major speech before it was set in stone. So rewriting is important. And take the general education courses. Yeah. Learn history, learn English, learn about the world, learn geography.
And live, I would assume.
Yeah.
Live in the world.
Live in the world, listen to the evening news, read the newspaper.
What about the ancient orators? Is it worth for the student to go back and read Cicero and...
Absolutely, absolutely. To see that eloquence is wonderful. Demosthenes, very famous. Read Pericles' funeral oration during the Peloponnesian War when Athens was had a plague, and here Pericles is celebrating the men who died in the war. That becomes the theme for Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address, which becomes the theme for George W. Bush after 9/11. These messages carry over through time, and so reading the ancients becomes very important. Speeches have changed history, have they not? Oh yeah. The most famous example from my perspective was the blood, sweat, toil, and tears speech of Winston Churchill. When he gave that speech, it was translated directly to Hitler. And Hitler sat there and said, "They're not going to give up. Forget about trying to take them. Let's turn on the Russians." And it changed history dramatically. And it was that speech that did it, that Churchill was so convincing that they were not going to go down, that it changed Hitler's mind. Share with me a couple other speeches that you particularly think, and you can go back to the ancient Greeks if you'd like, but that really turned the tide of history. There's a speech by a guy called Alcibiades, who was a general in Athens during the Peloponnesian War, and he convinced the Athenians to invade Syracuse on the island of Sicily, which was a colony of the Spartans, and it became their Vietnam. It went bad, and the Spartans won the war, and Athens was never the same again. So sometimes speeches do bad things, and we need to know that, and we need to know how those people succeeded so that we can counter their measures with effective rhetoric for the side of good. It's like Tolstoy said, you know, when bad men succeed only because good men don't fight them. And rhetoric is one of the ways of fighting. You weren't responsible for the read my lips, no new taxes? I contributed to that speech, but not that line. Not that line? Not that line. My George Bush was a kinder, gentler man. And I always tried to bring that side of him out. Peggy Noonan contributed to that speech, and that was the 1,000 Points of Light. I was going to bring that one up. But Vic Gold had a hand in that speech, and there you go. How big a mistake was that? We argued over it, because I don't think a president wants to tie himself up that way. I don't think you want to make that kind of pledge. Now, you can explain it. I mean, we had a war in Iraq, and the president came on television for 12 minutes explaining why he was going to have to raise taxes. He was followed by the Senate Majority Leader, George Mitchell, who explained that they were going to go along. They thought that that was all they needed to do. But when you're making a change that big, you cannot justify it in 12 minutes. You need to take a good half hour with the public and march them through why it was necessary to change your mind. Who's the best speechwriter out there today? Now that I'm no longer in the business. Right, yes. Well, we did kind of cover that. Let me rephrase that and say, who's the best orator out there today? That's a very good question. I kind of like, looking at the conventions, there were a number of people that I thought were good. Julian Castro, the mayor of San Antonio, gave a marvelous speech at the Democratic Convention, very emotional, very moving. I thought Michelle Obama's speech was terrific. At the Republican Convention, I really liked Chris Christie's direct honesty. He was interested in the truth, not in love. And I thought that was very good, very direct. I thought Marco Rubio was terribly appealing in his speech. He is the most verbal. He seems to flow the most. How would you write for him? How would you position him? I think that he's a natural. What's good about him is that you could bring an eloquence there, a sense of style that would take him to the next level. He's a good, fluent, direct speaker, but there are going to be occasions where he's going to be able to give a ceremonial speech where he could use a little bit of the high style, use a few more metaphors and tropes and figures, and move to a level like Martin Luther King Jr. did in August of '63 with the I Have a Dream speech.
Well, I have one final question for you. You have written, this will be your 16th book, and very much looking forward to reading it. You have 60-something scholarly academic papers that have been published. You are here at the University in Long Beach. Do you think you need a hobby, Craig?
I need some time off. My students often ask me, you know, what do you do in your spare time? And I really don't have any, because I'm constantly revising and having different writing projects. But writing has always been a gift to me. I was a depressive person, and I found out that when I wrote, the depression went away. And so I'm almost compulsive about writing, just to keep the black dog, as Winston Churchill called it, away and out of my life. And it's worked.
Fascinating. Well, I am looking forward to the book. Thank you so much for being here today. And it is Confessions of a Presidential Speechwriter by Craig R. Smith, Dr. Craig R. Smith. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
That was really fun.